Thank you. My name is Peter Schiff, and I guess you can say I am in the economic and financial gloom and doom business. And thanks to this body, President Obama, the Federal Reserve, business is booming. And, you know, I would rather profit from America's success rather than her failure, which is the reason that I'm here today. We have some serious structural problems underlying the U.S. economy, and we cannot solve them until we understand them. As a nation, we have borrowed and spent our way into a gigantic ditch. We are not going to get out of the ditch by digging it deeper. We have to reverse the mistakes of the past, not repeat them. Government stimulus will never grow this economy. It will never create jobs. It is the equivalent of trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. We have to understand that the housing bubble, the financial crisis of 2008, two events that I predicted and warned about, were the consequences of government stimulus. We stimulated our way into this problem. We're not going to stimulate our way out. In fact, the stimulus is actually a sedative. The stimulus is preventing the free market from unraveling the problems that years of bad monetary and fiscal policy have created. We don't need more spending. We need the opposite of spending. We need underconsumption. What the economy lacks is savings, investment, production. And if we try to preserve the jobs of the bubble economy with more reckless money printing and borrowing and government spending, all we are going to succeed in doing is preventing the restructuring that we need and preventing more productive jobs from ever coming into existence. And I want to talk, specifically about jobs. I'm an employer. I employ about 150 people. I would probably employ 1,000 more if it weren't for government regulations that have inhibited my ability to hire and grow my business and have forced me to move portions of my business overseas in order to escape the regulatory burden here. But the question is, why do I hire people? Where are these jobs coming from? Jobs in a free market, they come from two things. They come from profits or the profit motive, and they come from capital. You need both to create jobs. And in a free market, there's going to be jobs. And if there aren't enough jobs, Congress has to ask, what are we doing to inhibit this process? How are we preventing jobs that would normally be here from coming into existence? Now, in order for me to hire somebody, I have to be able to make a profit. That means that the person I hire has to deliver to me more value than the cost of employing them. And the cost of employing them is not just the wages I pay them, but it's all the mandatory benefits, the taxes, and more importantly, the legal liability that I incur when I hire somebody. In fact, one of the riskiest things you can do in America is to hire somebody. And because of that reason, because of all the liability from government, from lawsuits that you have put on employers, most small businesses, their main concern is how not to hire people. How can I grow my business and hire as few people as possible? That is not something that happens in the market. That is something that happens as a consequence of government. The other thing that you need to create jobs, in addition to profit, is capital. People work for me because I have capital. I have tools that my employees lack. They come to work, I give them an office, I give them secretarial support, I give them computers, I give them leads, I give them a brand, I give them all sorts of things. But where does capital come from? It comes from savings. It comes from underconsumption. Either I have to save it myself or I have to borrow it from somebody else. But there is no money to borrow because it's all going to government or something that government guarantees, like education or home mortgages. There is no credit available for small businesses. It's actually a paradox, but what we need is higher interest rates. Higher interest rates encourage savings. These low interest rates are of no benefit to typical businesses. Yeah, it benefits government. Government can borrow all this money through the bond market. Some of the major corporations have access to cheap money. Wall Street can gamble with it. But small businesses, they can't sell bonds. They need to borrow money, and there's no savings available. There is nothing there. So businesses can't get capital, and there is no incentive now to hire because the costs are too high. You're looking at somebody who's sitting here who was actually fined, and I'd be happy to talk my experience. I was fined $15,000 by security regulators because I hired too many people. Because I hired too many people, I incurred over $500,000 in legal bills defending myself because I hired too many people. Because I hired too many people, I've been on a hiring freeze ordered by regulators for 3 years. They have not let me hire people. They have not let me open new offices, despite the fact that I was dying to do it. I had plenty of demand. My business was growing, unfortunately, thanks to what you guys were doing. But regulators prohibited me from doing this. And there's all sorts of ways that rules and regulations have inhibited my business. In fact, it's now so expensive. I started my securities firm in 1996. There is no way that I could have started that firm today. I have an entire compliance department. It costs me millions of dollars a year just to stay in business, just to comply with rules and regulations that are not doing anything to protect my customers.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. We appreciate that good testimony. Mr. Lindsay, you get the last 5 minutes here. Mr. Schiff, your testimony actually reminded me of a comment a friend of mine made to me several years ago, actually, 4 or 5 years ago. He's got a brother, him and his brother, both friends of mine. Mike, the older one, typically the more direct one, said to me one time, he said, "Jim, I love being in business. I hate being an employer. And I hate being an employer," in Mike's direct way, "because of all this stuff you make us do." And he pointed right at me, talking about government. And it's not that Mike doesn't like people and wants to hire them. It's just he said exactly what, maybe not as eloquently as you put it, but exactly what you said. All the regulatory things that government makes them do is what makes it so tough for people to hire. Plus, I would make this case, and this is what I want you all to comment on, this idea that the spending, which is the deficits we're running, piling up the debt we're piling up, the job creators out there deep down understand they're probably going to have to pay for that too. At some point, that's got to be paid off as well. And I would argue that, maybe more than anything, is the biggest uncertainty they face. I think there's this huge link between the spending and the failure to create jobs. So a couple things that I want to run by. Would a freeze, like, well, talk to me about the spending, and we'll run down the list here, and then, or down the line, and also the regulatory issue. Senator Johnson has a bill which simply says no more new regulation, just stop the damage where it's at. And I want your thoughts on that, plus on this link between the spending and the job creation. We'll start with Professor Taylor and work down the list.
First, on the issue of regulations, I think we need to be very careful that we're very specific about what we're talking about. In today's New York Times, for example, there was an article about whether or not the FDA would regulate new forms of E. coli in our hamburgers. Now, that creates a level playing field, so every producer knows that everyone else needs to make sure that they're not allowing hazardous foods. That's an important regulation, and certainly it costs businesses money, but that's important for consumer health. I don't know when I see that hamburger what's inside of it. That's critical. So this sort of blanket regulatory stuff, we need to dig down deep into that. Second, we had an over 8% drop in GDP because of the crisis. That is a massive hole to fill. And I concur with my colleagues over here that, it may have been that the housing bubble was at an elevated level of demand flowing through the economy because of the housing bubble, but that doesn't change the fact that when you pull it out of the economy, you have a gaping hole, and that's left 14 million people out of work. It is that hole that government spending is the only entity right now can fill, unless we're going to dramatically increase our experts. Very quickly, my third point, around this uncertainty question, certainly, there's always uncertainty in the economy, but I think we should have been asking ourselves in the early 2000s how we were going to pay for those massive tax cuts that we did when we were also having two unfunded wars. I didn't hear as much discussion around that then, but those are the kinds of questions we should have been asking, and a part of why we're here today. Thank you.
Mr. Schiff.
Sure. Well, first of all, demand doesn't come from government spending. Inflation comes from government spending. Demand comes from supply. You can't consume something that isn't produced. So we have to make things first. But as far as regulations are concerned, certainly we need to stop piling new regulations on top of the existing regulations. But more importantly, we got to start repealing a lot of the rules and regulations that are already in place. Look, there are millions of Americans that are unemployed. How do we increase the demand for labor? It's simple. You bring down the cost of labor. Regulations substantially increase the cost of employing people, and as a result, fewer people are employed. I mean, there are simple things you can do, from getting rid of the minimum wage law, which you could do this afternoon, which would create millions of jobs, and more importantly, help people get trained for much higher paying jobs in the future. Right now, they're never going to get jobs. But the regulations that increase labor costs and that subject employers to all sorts of lawsuits if they don't create jobs in precisely the manner that some bureaucrat thinks they should be created. You have to level the playing field between employers and employees. You can't lose your rights because you hire somebody. You can't give workers some kind of special privilege and then call it a workers' rights. Workers don't have special rights because they get a job. Everybody has individual rights, and you shouldn't lose them because you hire somebody.
$14 trillion debt. We raised it $2.4 trillion. We got $21 billion in savings the first year. I always tell folks, you got to put it in family terms. This is the kid gets a credit card, runs a bill up to $14,000, says, well, you know what, that's just not enough. Goes to the bank says, all right, we'll give you $2,400 more, but you have to promise us over the course of the next year, in your budget that you planned on spending, you will spend $21 less than you planned on spending. That was the deal. I would argue Standard & Poor's downgraded us because of the lack of the deal, the agreement addressing how serious this situation is. And to insinuate that, oh, it was because Congress had a vigorous debate, I thought that's what we're supposed to do in Congress, right?
Congress is certainly supposed to have a vigorous debate.
Exactly.
Part of the puzzle, though, was that this Congress refused to put raising taxes, especially on the wealthy, as a part of that package. And that would have been an important way to get to the goal that S&P wanted. I mean, you sort of...
And an important way to tax the people who create jobs, too.
And that caused the crisis.
Yeah. Mr. Schiff.
It was definitely.
We're going to get to the good doctor from Tennessee next, and then our ranking
member. It was definitely the deal, not the discussion. And with due respect, I did call the financial bubble, and I criticized S&P and Moody's and Fitch at the time for putting AAA ratings on bonds that I knew were going to go to zero. And in my opinion, S&P didn't downgrade the United States far enough. That's the problem. But I would love to address some of the points that Mr. Cummings made.
Make it real quick if you could, Mr. Schiff, because I want to get to...
Well, he made so many points, but you're right about one thing, that the bad regulation didn't start under Obama. We have a lot of regulations that need to be undone, but it's not just the intent. I don't argue with you that in some cases the intent of the regulation is good. The problem is the consequences are the exact opposite of the intent. And infrastructure, infrastructure spending doesn't stimulate the economy. It drains the economy of resources. Infrastructure only helps in the long run when you finish the project if it raises the productivity of the nation. But in the meantime, we are too broke. China can put in these airports because they're rich. We're broke. Before we can afford to improve the infrastructure, we need to have more serious restructuring of our economy. We have to start making stuff. We need more factories before we can start figuring out how to make our roads prettier.
Mr. Lindsay, real quick, was it the debate or the deal?
So I can't speak for S&P. I don't work there. I wasn't privy to all their deliberations. From my own perspective, the combination of an utterly unsustainable fiscal situation and a political process that does not look like it's terribly serious about coming to grips with it merited an alarm bell.
Yeah. 15 seconds. 15 seconds for the ranking member. The good doctor from Tennessee.
Let me just say this. I've read this 50 million times. Their concern was that there were members of Congress that were going around talking about not raising the debt ceiling. That was one of their major concerns, and saying we don't have to do that. That's
what you should have done. If you didn't raise the debt ceiling, then we could have cut spending. So you said that we were paying our bills. We don't pay our bills by going deeper into debt. That's avoiding paying our bills and guaranteeing eventual default.
Gentleman from Tennessee, the good doctor is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was one of those guys going around saying that we shouldn't raise the debt ceiling without significant cuts. And we saw what happened because we didn't get significant cuts. And I'm all in favor of rebuilding our infrastructure and making our bridges safe. We had a bridge in Minnesota that collapsed years ago, and that's become the poster child for our failing infrastructure. We have millions of bridges that work just fine. But the point is, what I don't get is how we're going to pay for this. We continue to borrow and spend money. We've got a stimulus 2 coming up that we need to talk about here a little bit to see if it's feasible and how it's going to be paid for. But I do agree with Mr. Cummings that it doesn't matter really where these regulations came from. The fact is that there's too darn many, and in the American Jobs Creators Tour and my stops across Tennessee, the #1 complaint and impediment to job growth, according to the 30-plus industries I've visited, is that we need to get government out of the way. And we're simply not doing that with this. We're looking at 219 new regulations by this President costing over $38 billion, and this new plan that was just proposed is going to show an increase of 10,000 new regulators a year. Certainly that doesn't seem to be solving the problems that we're set out to do. As far as paying for this, Dr. Boucher, you said that it's time to increase taxes on the rich, or we're going to get back into this let's spread the wealth mentality to get ourselves out of the problem. How exactly do you think that is going to solve the problem? And as far as the taxes on the rich and the removal of the deduction in the charitable contribution area, can you comment on that and how you think that's going to solve the problem?
Thank you. As many of us have talked about today, we clearly have a long-term deficit problem. We have a gap. We have a challenge there. One of the things that we've seen over the past few decades is that America has become a fairly low-tax country, and one of the things that we've done is that we've extended these tax cuts on the wealthiest.
Well, let me interrupt. Do we tax too little or do we spend too much as a government? I mean, look at our deficit.
Exactly. Relative to other countries, we are a relative low-tax country, and we are not a relative high spender.
Are we a high-spending country?
No.
We're not?
No.
Well, how did we get in
not
this
relative
mess?
to our GDP and relative to other countries. No. I mean, I would be more than happy after this to send you a series of charts that document this.
Do you think that taxing or closing the loophole on charitable contributions is going to hurt charities?
That is only for families, for wealthy families, and I think over the long run, no. I mean, I think that what is important.
Wealthy families over what amount? 250,000.
250,000 for a married
wealthy
couple.
family. Who do you think usually gives the most to charities?
It is a wealthy family. Those are families in the very top of the United States income distribution. Those are families that have benefited from economic growth over the past few decades, while other families have not. So they have benefited more from the 2000s, more during the 1980s, more during the 1990s than middle-class and lower-income families. So asking them to pay their fair share does seem like an appropriate place if we are all focused on closing that deficit. It has to come from somewhere. It can't come from families that have not seen income gains.
Mr. Schiff, do you have a comment on that?
I'd like to ask Dr. Boucher, what percentage of my income do you think the government should take? What would be fair?
Make sure your mic's on, Mr. Schiff.
Yeah, what percentage of my income should the government take? What do you think would be fair?
I'm not going to give you a number
just give me a
right
guess.
here. Yeah.
Well, what do you think would be fair? You say I'm not paying enough taxes. How high should my taxes be? What percentage of my income should be taken away from me by the government?
We have a progressive income tax
Right, but
structure.
what do you think would
have
half? 60%, 70%? How much should they take?
Wow, well, that is so far beyond.
Well, we're going to wait.
But I'm just,
hang on.
Let me say that taxing the rich.
The gentleman from Tennessee has the time.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt. Taxing the rich is a great idea till the rich run out of money, and that seems to be
no,
the
my problem is
process.
I'm already almost paying
Hang on a
half my
second.
income in taxes
hang on a
right
second.
now.
Hey, hang on a second.
That is impossible.
No, it's not impossible.
Incorrect.
No, it's not.
Okay,
You want to see my tax returns?
Mr. Chairman, let's shift gears for 1 second because this is going to go on forever.
35.
Dr. Boucher, do you feel that government, Dr. Boucher, do you feel that government jobs create revenue? And I think you said that the stimulus one had the majority of jobs created were private sector jobs. Do public jobs create revenue, or do they just cost the taxpayers money?
Recovery dollars that go onto communities to, say, build a bridge. You hire engineers, typically in the private sector, some in the public, some in the private. You hire contractors. You hire people that do concrete. You hire a lot of folks in the private sector, and then that has spillover effects. So that if you hire that person who has the concrete, and then they go and they have more money, and so they spend it in their community, that's how those private sector jobs are created, both directly and indirectly.
Mr. Schiff, do you feel that's a good return on your investment to spend those tax dollars that way? I mean, what's your chance of making a profit?
Well, first I want to point out that 99% of my income is taxed at the marginal rate. So the marginal rate is my rate. And if the Federal Government has taken 35% of my income, and then another 3% for Medicare, that's 38, and then when I have the State of Connecticut now almost 7%, over 45% of my income in tax, and that's before I pay any property taxes or sales taxes or anything else like that. And if you raise my taxes much more, that's it. I'm done. I'm already moving businesses to Singapore, moving businesses to the Caribbean to try to go to lower tax jurisdictions. We are not a low-tax country. We are a high-tax country, and we're a much higher-tax country than we used to be in the past by far. And I don't remember what your other question was.
Well, I'm out of time, but I'm just going to close with the fact that we continue to spend money at an unprecedented rate. And as Mr. Cummings said, I think people were very shocked at the debt ceiling debate. But my stance, and at least from what I gather from the folks from Tennessee, is they're shocked that we once again increase our debt ceiling by $2.4 trillion and waited over cuts over 10 years that they don't have any faith that's going to happen. So I would say that the shock and outrage with what happened up here was more the fact that we allowed this to happen, that we once again spent our children and grandchildren's money, and I yield back.
Thank you, Doctor.
So in your opinion, and I know you do the same thing, I have to borrow a lot of money for my business to work, but when you can't borrow it, or when the regulations becomes too overburdened, that it makes it difficult for lenders to give it to you, it's bothersome to me. So I think it's very important that people understand this isn't easy what we're doing. It's very difficult, and government's made it harder for us. You have to hit your mic, sir.
It takes two to tango. I mean, you can only borrow if somebody is saving. There has to be a lender on the other side of that transaction. There has to be something in it for the lender. You have to have higher interest rates. The problem is the banks are just getting money from the Federal Reserve and turning around and buying treasuries with it. That's not going to grow the economy. That's going to grow the government. But meanwhile, these monetary policies are stifling the savings that we need to grow the economy. And Mr. Cummings pointed about he can, when people get a stimulus job, he can see those jobs. Yeah, you can always see the jobs that government creates. What you don't see are the jobs that they destroyed to create those jobs. All the government can do is rearrange the resources. It doesn't create any wealth. But the problem is the jobs or the wealth that gets destroyed is more productive than whatever the government replaces it with. And so on balance, the country is poorer as a result of that. And it doesn't, the fact that if we send out a stimulus check, it's not going to stimulate the economy. If an American goes and buys some more products that were made in China, how does that help our economy? It runs up the trade deficit, and now we had to go deeper into debt to spend that stimulus check. All of that is counterproductive. And we're going to continue to repeat these mistakes. We're going to keep on throwing gasoline on this fire until we incinerate the entire country.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Now I yield to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Burkle.
Most top economists are saying that the President's American Jobs Act will boost the economy and create jobs. And Mark Zandi, chief economist for Moody's Analytics, is forecasting a 1.9 million job boost and a 2% lift for GDP if the President's package is passed as proposed. Alan Sinai, chief economist of Decision Economics, states, and I quote, "Payroll tax cuts are very powerful. They provide a boost to direct income and in turn spending, which is important to growth." This 2% tax cut, Mr. Schiff, you're in agreement with that payroll?
No.
You're in disagreement with that?
I think the deficits that will be created to finance that tax, I think the deficits that will be created to finance that tax cut will do more damage to undermine this economy and destroy jobs than any benefit we will get from the extra income being spent.
And so when the President says that, basically borrowing the words of my Republican friends, that we should not be increasing taxes during a recession, but when it comes to these taxes, you have do you agree with that, first of all? Well, in other words, when it came to the millionaires and billionaires, my Republican friend says, friends, and I heard them clear. Let me finish. They were singing from the same handbook. They were singing loud and clear. In a recession, you do not raise taxes. And the President said it the other night, said, we want to make sure these folks continue to get this extra $1,500 or whatever it is in that $1,000 to $1,500 on their paychecks. Go ahead.
The problem is the damage that the government does to the economy is not limited to taxation. It's spending. It's what the government is spending that is damaging the economy. And so if we run deficits instead of taxes, we actually do more damage. Deficit spending is more detrimental to the economy than taxation.
I got you.
But what we need to do is dramatically reduce government spending. That is the only stimulus that will work.
We'll disagree on that. I think we need to do both. I don't think that there's any member of Congress that does not believe that we need to do both. Mr. Boucher, what's your opinion on that?
Well, it's hard to understand how government spending
I'm sorry, Dr. Boucher. I like to give people their titles, like President Obama.
Thank you, Congressman Cummings. It's hard to imagine how spending, that right now when interest rates are at historic lows, when people still want to buy U.S. Treasuries, when we have this massive unmet need in terms of both infrastructure, but all of the massive layoffs that have happened in education around America because of the state and local budget crunches, that using government dollars right now for those, it is hard to understand how that is not easy for us to do because we can afford it, and B, that does not help our economy. Having children in school in schoolrooms in places across the country with 40 children is not good for America's future. It's not good for America's workforce. We can do something to fix that. We can borrow at historic low rates, and we can pay it back as the economy gets back on track. And I'd like to take issue with one thing that Mr. Schiff said earlier, which is that America can't afford it. America remains one of the richest countries on the planet. To say that we cannot afford to make these investments right now when our economy needs it most and get 14 million people back to work is quite frankly absurd. We can afford it. It's just how we're using our resources.
We can afford it. And the problem is interest rates are low now. They're not going to stay low. We've got a $15 trillion national debt financed with Treasury bills. It's the same mistake that people made who were taking out subprime mortgages. What's going to happen when rates are at 5% or 10%? What's going to happen when interest on the national debt consumes 100% of Federal tax receipts? That can happen in just a few years. Interest rates got to 20% in 1980. What happens if they go there again?
Madam Chair, I see my time is up, but I just want to need 15 seconds to say this. You know, one of the things that we've got to do, we have got to invest in our people. If you got kids, one of the greatest threats to our national security is our failure to properly educate every single one of our children. That's the greatest threat. And if we have to spend now to educate our children so that they can take over this world, innovate, create jobs, and do the right thing, fine. At the rate we're going, though, if we're not careful, we will implode from the inside because we're not doing all the things we need to do now.
We're spending and not educating. We don't need more spending on education. We're spending too much, and kids are not getting educated. We need more on-the-job training. Unfortunately, we have too many kids going to college on government grants. It's bid up the price into the stratosphere, and we have all these kids graduating with huge mortgages and no houses and no marketable skills.
I'm saddened by those comments.
Well,
thank you,
I'm
Mr.
saddened
Schiff.
by what those programs have done to our young people.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Schiff, because I believe you're onto something, and I would tell for those that did not experience this, I remember it very vividly because I paid 1% over prime for my floor plan costs. So in the early 80s, when prime was around 21%, which people said that's not possible, it is, and in the artificially low rates that we're working with today. Any type of an idea or a scenario, what could happen when these rates that are being kept artificially low, and we know for the next, at least until the election, there's going to be a low prime rate. But when it rises to what it should be, market value, the effect that it's going to have on businesses.
Well, I mean, the problem, the artificially low interest rates right now are one of the main problems that the economy has. And I think we're pursuing those rates to prop up insolvent banks, to necessitate the government bubble, the borrowing from the Federal Government. And when interest rates ultimately rise, all the banks that you guys bailed out, they're all going to fail again because they're insolvent. They're only kept afloat by the cheap money from the Fed. Their portfolios are loaded up with low-yielding, long-term mortgages and government bonds. And when interest rates go up, the value of those assets will collapse. But they have to go up because eventually the dollar will sink so much, prices will rise so much, nobody will lend us money. The dollar won't be the reserve currency. Right now it's kind of benefiting from the fact that there are problems in other parts of the world. But look at the price of gold. It's at $1,900 an ounce for a reason. Right? It's going up because of all the inflation that we're creating now and all the inflation that we're going to have to create in order to keep interest rates at these low levels. And the only way to solve our problems is to let interest rates go up. And they're going to go way up. And then what are we going to do? I mean, if we keep inflating this bubble, if we let the national debt get to $20 trillion and then rates go to 10 or 20%, you know, what people are saying now is exactly what they said during the real estate bubble. People used to tell me, Peter, you're crazy. Real estate prices will never fall. Well, now we know what happened. People are now saying the same thing with interest rates. We don't have to worry because interest rates will never rise. They will stay low forever. They won't.
No, and you're right. The only thing we know for sure is they're not going to rise before the next election.
Well, we don't know that for sure. They're going to try everything they can to prevent it.
And the other thing is going to happen is we print money that isn't backed by anything. Our lenders are going to say at some point, you're paying me back with money that isn't worth what I lent you.
We're destroying the value of our money, and that's why prices are rising. Oil prices aren't going up. You know, in fact, Ron Paul pointed it out in his last debate. You can buy a gallon of gasoline for a dime, as long as you have a dime that was minted before 1965. It's because our money is being debased by the Federal Reserve, and that's what's happening. Prices aren't going anywhere. The value of our money is declining, and it's going to lose a lot more value in a very short period of time if we continue these policies.
And the President's new plan there's a $4,000 incentive for hiring people who have been unemployed for long periods of time. For somebody like yourself who's an employer, and somebody who, like myself, who is an employer, who interviews people, are we picking winners and losers as to who it is we're going to hire?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. In fact, this is another example of things that are going to backfire. The government is proposing a plan to make it illegal for employers to discriminate against people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. The effect of this is going to be is nobody is going to interview anybody who's been unemployed for more than 6 months because they don't want to risk a lawsuit. All this plan is going to do is going to mean if somebody was going to hire somebody anyway, they'll try to hire somebody they'll try to interview people who have been unemployed for about 5 months so they can start them at the 6th month so they can get the tax credit, but it's simply going to shift jobs away from people who are newly unemployed or long-term unemployed to people who have been unemployed for a specific period of time. I think the most it's going to do is influence minimum wage, because basically I said earlier that we should abolish the minimum wage. What that $4,000 tax credit does is temporarily substantially reduce the minimum wage for a 6-month period of time. So I think on the margin you'll create some minimum wage type jobs on a temporary basis, but it's not going to be any kind of great stimulus. And as I said, the deficits that we will generate to finance the tax cuts will destroy more jobs than those tax cuts create.
Yeah. And I would agree with you on a lot of these things. It is totally bizarre to me that the people we expect to do the most lifting are the people that we put the most burden on, and continue to overburden them with regulations that really don't, in the long run, cost-benefit analysis doesn't plan out. I'm not saying they weren't good intentions to start with, but when you look what's happened, and it makes it so difficult on those people who are absolutely being depended upon to lift that load, it is bizarre to me that anybody could look at this logically and think this is a plan that makes sense, when in the history of the world we don't have any data that would suggest that that's possible. So thanks so much for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I now recognize Mr. Kucinich.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, Mr. Kucinich, unfortunately he left, but he made the point that prior stimuluses had enjoyed bipartisan support. Well, they didn't enjoy my support. I opposed them at the time. All of the efforts by government in the past to artificially stimulate the economy have failed. They have worsened the problem. The recession is actually part of the cure. The recession needs to be allowed to run its course. The reason we're never going to have a real recovery is because the government won't let us have a real recession. We have serious economic imbalances that I mentioned. We have an economy that is based on spending borrowed money. That can't be. Economies have to be based on savings and investing and production. We're trying to run an economy upside down. And in order to maintain it, we have to keep interest rates at zero. We have to run these huge imbalances. We have to import all these goods that we don't produce. We have to borrow from the rest of the world. We have to allow the restructuring to take place. And until that happens, until we allow that to happen, we're not going to create jobs. We're not going to have any real economic growth. We can't just keep repeating the mistakes. But I know, and this is a political body, it is very difficult for politicians to level with the American public about how severe these problems are and how they are the consequence of years and years of mistakes made by Congress and by the Federal Reserve. There is a free market cure. It will work if the government gets out of the way and lets it happen. It's going to be painful. Just like anyone who has a drug habit, they check into rehab, they will come out better. But it's not going to work if every time they feel the withdrawal symptoms, they take another shot of heroin, because that's what these stimuluses are. It's a shot of monetary or fiscal heroin, and it's not going to work, and it only means that the eventual withdrawal is that much more painful because we got that much more drugs in the system that have to come out.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lindsay.
Isn't that part of the challenge we face today, is if you can produce a better product for less, which also includes less labor, that's how you end up being a world-class creator of jobs? Isn't that the principle that for some reason stimulus, simply adding jobs by paying for them, does the exact opposite of less labor perhaps, but world-class labor that produces a better product for less? Mr. Schiff.
Absolutely. In fact, to point out, Henry Ford was famous for paying his workers $5 a day.
Highest in the world at the time.
Yeah, but that was 1.25 ounces of gold, which at today's exchange rate is $2,500 a week. So Ford's workers were making $2,500 a week, the equivalent. They were paying no federal income taxes and no payroll taxes. There was no minimum wage and there were no unions. We paid the highest wages in the world, yet we produced the best quality, least expensive products. How was that possible? That was because we had the smallest government. We had minimal regulations, low taxes. And if we want to recreate American industry, we have to recreate that environment. We have to allow businesses to grow and prosper, and we have to remove all the roadblocks and the impediments that Congress has placed in their path over the years.
Dr. Boucher, you're sort of surrounded here, so I'll give you the last word.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm glad that Mr. Schiff brought up the $5 a day. That was an important point. The reason that Henry Ford did that, of course, was to reduce turnover and to keep highly skilled workers. So that certainly tells you something, and it'd be great to see more employers taking that high road strategy today that we don't see enough here in America.
Thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chairman Issa. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for coming here today and taking time out of your busy schedules. We appreciate that very much. And at this time, this hearing stands adjourned.